And welcome to our webinar on cybersecurity in the cloud with a very weird Shakespearean title. And I would like to introduce our moderator, Professor Costis Toregas, who is the director of GW's Institute on Privacy and Security Policy. And I'd also like to thank our sponsors who have eagerly co-organized this event with us. So thank you all for joining us. Costis, take it away.
Thanks, Susan. And I'm delighted to welcome three excellent voices to help us part the clouds of confusion about cloud security. I thought that the quote from Shakespeare was a wonderful one, so I'm going to read it. I actually printed it out. It's Clarence telling King Edward IV that a little gale will soon disperse the cloud and blow it to the source from whence it came. The very beams will dry those vapors up, for every cloud engenders not a storm. And I thought it was a very wise choice of a title, because sometimes people panic and begin to say, well, nothing is sacred, nothing is safe, nothing is secure. And it's wise to think back several hundred years to people that said not every cloud engenders a storm. So the panel that we have assembled here to discuss cloud security and associated topics of data in the global cloud include Trey Herr, Trey Wave, there we go, who's the director of Cyber Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council. We then have Josephine Wolff. Josephine, welcome. Assistant Professor Cybersecurity Policy at Tufts. And finally, we have Chelsea Smethurst. Hi, Chelsea, who's a senior security strategy in cybersecurity for Microsoft. Excellent panel, and let's just get right into it. I'll start with some questions and just go around the table. If you feel compelled to be the first, wave, and I'll be very happy to recognize you. Otherwise, maybe we'll just rotate the assignment. Trey, I'm going to start the first question with you. The cloud is something wonderful. For me, personally, it had a wonderful effect. I love to go to Greece for summers, and I used to have to take lots of digital devices to store all my data. And all of a sudden, the cloud came about, and I no longer have to take anything. I just kind of beam myself into the cloud, and I'm back at GW magically. All my data is there. But of course, it comes with some dangers. So the ability for data controllers to keep various types of data safe perhaps is now expanded. Can you help us kind of figure out, first of all, what's the cloud? Is it useful? Can it be used in cybersecurity? And then what are the responsibilities of cloud service providers towards their customer? That's a broad question, and I wonder if you can just start us off.
It's a good question, and I have to say I like the framing. The cloud exists to take us to Mykonos, right? So I think that's our goal at the end of the day with this. And thanks Costis and Susan and the partners of the DataGovHub for having us and letting us talk about cloud. It's certainly a topic that's gotten a lot of attention in the last, I don't know, decade plus. So to your questions quickly, what is the cloud? The cloud is a very physical set of infrastructure spread around the world, operated by companies on behalf of customers. What does that mean? Really, it's old 1970s, 1980s era ideas about computing being run on incredibly modern hardware by large and increasingly, I would say, influential and innovative companies, where they take computing resources like a virtual machine, like networking capacity, like your 10 gigabytes of storage that you get for free every month, and make that available to anyone around the world. And they do that using some technical wizardry, which is really not all that wizard-like, but has a magical quality, taking basic computing components and making them available to all customers. This idea that many people can work off of a single computing machine. At its root, cloud computing is shared resources, lots of people using the same computers. It's remote access. It's you accessing those resources, those computers over the web. And in particular, it's shared services with respect to different customers. So when we think about a cloud computing environment, while you and an employee at Walmart and someone in the state government of Louisiana might be sharing the same cloud network you're existing in your own secured little service. But within your organization, you might be sharing that service over tens or hundreds of employees. So cloud computing lets us slice and dice computing in lots of very interesting and creative ways. Why does that become interesting? You mentioned data and data controllers. Well, we give cloud providers access to our data. We allow them to learn about us and our data, and we give them the ability to learn about their own systems. So there's at least 3 different types of data in play in this discussion. There's my user data, what I give to you. There's derived data about me, what you learn from watching me use your service. And then at least another category, system data, which is what you, the provider, are learning about your own platform, your own data centers, as I'm using your services. And so one of the challenges that we're increasingly running into, and I say we in the sense of the abstract global policy community, is how we govern that data, who can use it, touch it, store it, manipulate it, and combine it with other kinds of data, is increasingly subject to a disparate set of rules developed by different governments and in some cases supranational institutions, with varying degrees of technical specificity, as well as a host of industry self-regulatory models. And the challenge is that at the end of the day, for all of the marketing, for all of the snazzy capabilities, and for all of the acres long data centers that are being built at a rapid clip around the globe, cloud computing really comes back to data. Can't do very much without it. Either what you're processing, what you're getting for it, what you're computing on it as I give it to you, the cloud provider, what the cloud provider has to offer you, what collaborators across the world are doing with data that they share. Data is really at the center of this discussion. So I think to come to your last question on security, a lot of what we see in the discussion about cloud is the opportunity to do things with data that individual users or small organizations wouldn't otherwise be able to learn from the same profile, same risk profile of other similar looking organizations around the world or around a country, to manage their services using the kind of central computing features that have been developed to work for tens of thousands of customers, leveraging all of that insight and being engineered by some of the best security engineering minds in the world, all within the confines of one company. The flip side to that is when we talk about using cloud, we're giving over a degree of control and accepting a certain level of transparency, which is likely different from managing our own infrastructure and having our own data center. On the one hand, for a lot of users, it's not feasible. And at GW, right, there's not that many research institutes that are buying their own rack and filling it with a server and populating it with all sorts of software that they need. It's infeasible. So from the cloud computing side, it gives users the opportunity to access services that they might not otherwise have been able to manage on their own, and in a fashion that might be more secure, where that security is dictated by this common architecture, this common idea and infrastructure that we use to build cloud. The flip side, however, and the challenge that we run into is exactly how we are able to manipulate those systems, set those rules by which the systems behave, access the data that's generated about us, vary between jurisdiction and vary in some cases between company. So we get into this really fun conversation and we have discussions like this with highly appropriate Shakespeare quotes and some really excellent experts from both academia and industry to raise the issue and try to talk us through it. So I hope that answers at least the first couple slices of your question.
Thanks, Trey. And I'm just wondering, even mundane things like government procurement and what kinds of stuff should go into a legal agreement when you turn over data to someone that you don't know, you haven't vetted personally. So a lot of things to parse. Chelsea, I see you smiling. Would you like to offer some advice or build on what Trey said from the industry viewpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I think he hit on a lot of really important points. I think one thing that I personally find very helpful to think about this conversation when we think about ultimately the pieces are data, right, in the cloud. It's something that we see with customers, we see with clients, I saw before I joined Microsoft, is this understanding of shared responsibility. And I guess that's sort of like a very generic way to say, recognize that you've got your data owners, right, your customers, or, yourself as an individual. And then you also sort of have the data custodians, which that might be the cloud service providers. It could be other like application service providers. Just anybody sort of using and interacting your data that has a responsibility to protect it at the end of the day. And so, we try to think about this in terms of, it's sort of like a matrix chart, right? Where you've got your own responsibilities, like to what extent do I protect my own data as a customer or individual? And then to what responsibilities should the cloud service provider be protecting my data? And then of course, there's lots of overlaps too, right? Where you've got like a double pronged approach to protect data, which is ultimately the best. And so something, from a challenge perspective, it's really important to really understand that upfront. And you bring up procurement, and actually that's a really good place to talk about these things, right? Understanding sort of the contractual obligations, understanding those responsibilities around security and where kind of that lies. So I'll just add that point. I think Trey covered that pretty well. I just wanted to say how we kind of think about the conversation when we're sort of engaging with our customers.
Yeah, thanks, Chelsea. And Josephine, I know that earlier in the year you've spoken a lot about COVID-19 and how it's beginning to wake us up to the fact that as we share data, and of course we want to share data, we also have to be thinking. And I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit of a COVID perspective on the cloud as you answer Trey's question.
That's interesting. So I think largely the cloud story has been a big success during COVID. And I mean that mostly in terms of capacity, right? I think that, say, watching Zoom scale up how many calls it was able to host, to my mind, is something that wouldn't even have been conceivable without like the resources of an entity like Amazon Web Services. And the fact that it's gone as smoothly as it has, I think is a real testament to sort of just how much capacity and how scalable some of those cloud architectures are. I do think that sort of there are some interesting trade-offs from the security and privacy standpoint that Trey and Chelsea have just touched on. I'll say one of the things, not just during COVID, but perhaps especially that I think is interesting about sort of thinking through who's using the cloud and what they get out of it, is that I think for a lot of cloud customers, the idea of sort of offloading the responsibilities around data protection and security is a big part of the appeal, right? And being able to say, you know what, we're a small business that's not particularly focused on figuring out how to do cybersecurity. We would love to put that in the hands of a Microsoft, put that in the hands of an Amazon, of a company that sort of has a lot of resources to devote to security, thinks about these issues really deeply, has been part of the appeal. And I think from a security perspective has actually been advantageous in a lot of ways to sort of have more of that security centralized around entities that have a lot of resources and have a lot of expertise in it. I think the sort of the issue that Chelsea raises around shared responsibility, I think is a really complicated one. Because there are certainly cloud customers, and we see this from governments that use commercial cloud services. We see this from, I would say, some of the larger companies that rely on them that have a very deep understanding of sort of what exactly they want from their cloud and are even kind of involved in trying to design a particular setup that complies with their particular requirements. I think there are also a lot of customers that don't necessarily have as deep an understanding or don't even necessarily want to be as involved or feel as responsible. And for them, sort of part of the appeal of the cloud was we don't have to worry about protecting our own data. We don't have to sort of take on that role ourselves. And I think sort of coming back to the COVID framing, right now we're seeing a lot of businesses, a lot of schools, including my own, that sort of have to shift things remote and handle a lot of meetings and a lot of stored data in ways that they didn't anticipate and certainly didn't have a lot of time to prepare for, relying more and more heavily on cloud providers in a variety of ways to scale up their capacity for that. And also in turn, relying a lot more heavily on them for all of the sort of security and privacy protections that are built in by default, where they either don't necessarily know enough to ask for particular types of protections or don't necessarily want to go down that road for whatever reason. And I think that's been largely, again, a success story. I think, we owe a lot to the cloud companies right now in terms of scaling up our ability to do remote work, but also probably inevitably a little bit of a story of all of us ending up with more of the defaults than we perhaps would have had we not been pushed into this a little faster than we might have predicted or wanted.
That's great. I wondered, Trey, since you opened up and heard two excellent expositions following yourself up, whether you want to kind of wrap it up a little bit.
I love this. I mean, this is a part of what makes cloud really interesting is you've got a diverse set of perspectives on corporate governance, on technology governance, on technology use and regulation, as well as just the basic application of what does this do for me. So I just want to fall on one theme I think that got developed. There is, and the market has demonstrated that especially for small companies, there's a significant benefit to using cloud from a security standpoint. Organizations are able to tap into software that wouldn't be built or sold to them at a feasible rate or with a feasible manageable level of complexity in many other cases. And they're able to tap into the learned experience of many other organizations of their size and character and larger and different. But the caveat to that I'd add is this. Part of the challenge with the modern hyperscale cloud provider, of which there are probably 4 around the world, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and Alibaba, we tend to draw from the conversation, but certainly in East Asia and increasingly in the EU and the US, is that there is a degree of vertical integration in that technology where a single provider is making choices that yield some security benefits, some efficiency benefits, some cost savings in the way they deliver their services. But because there's not a competitive pressure inside of the company on how a lot of those choices are taken, the customer and the user has less and less influence over where those choices go at a high level. And so this is really not an issue in terms, you were not influencing the way Intel built its chips 10 years ago and the laptops that you bought. That's true for me. It's true for everybody on the call as individuals, even as small organizations. But you did have the option to pick between Intel and AMD. You did have the ability to choose between multiple different PDF readers. And so part of the challenge we run into is that as this collectivization of the market occurs, and we see cloud services being offered in, at a certain level, very homogeneous and in other ways, very diverse ways, the choices those providers make on our behalf about how their systems are architected, about how they govern and handle their data outside of regulatory requirements, about how much control they grant the user, start to create constraints that are very difficult to navigate and aren't really subject to the normal competitive pressures that we would have if there was a diversity of offerings at each level of the stack, right? Where in this case, competitive pressure is not between different companies providing the same service, but between different companies providing complementary services, because there's certainly intense pressure, competitive pressure in the cloud market. So something just for us to think about as this transition is taking place, as we're seeing cloud adoption spike from a lot to almost everyone, is that there are some trade-offs in all of this kind of wonderful efficiency and functionality.
That's very useful, Trey. And I hear the whisperings of, is there a government role then to substitute in a sense for this lack of competitiveness? So maybe I'm going to go to Joe next. Joe, we've all applauded the creation and the good work of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. They were called out in the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, back a couple of years ago, and they've continued to do great work in a variety of areas pertaining to cybersecurity. I wonder whether, you might want to talk to us a little bit about the Solarium Commission, but more importantly, the fact that in one of their recommendations, they zoomed in and asked for some kind of a cloud security certification. Who would certify, what would be the metrics, and so on, all these questions. Is that a good idea? What do you say?
My gut instinct is yes. I think it probably is a good idea. So to rewind a little, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission is a group set up through Congress a couple years ago now to sort of do a comprehensive look at what the US government should do around cybersecurity from the perspective of the private sector, from the perspective of government protection for its own data, a whole bunch of different topics. They touch on everything from cloud computing to cyber insurance to data breach notification and protection laws. And I think the recommendation around cloud security certification is a not very sort of radical one, in the sense that it's, compared to some of the more aggressive recommendations they make around regulation, this is a pretty kind of tempered or moderate step to say, we've got, as Trey says, a very small number of very big companies that almost everybody is relying on. We think on the whole, right, that they're at least sort of the US based ones that we have the most visibility into in the US are mostly doing a pretty good job on security, right? We haven't seen at least very large, serious security issues or breaches around any of them. But we also know that people who are purchasing these solutions don't necessarily have a lot of knowledge or a lot of visibility into kind of what it is that they're getting by way of security. That's sort of something that's famously difficult to assess. And a lot of it is done kind of on the ad hoc, like, well, everybody uses Amazon, they must be secure. Everybody, believes Microsoft and Google have a lot of smart people, it must be fine. And so I think the idea behind a certification process, there are a couple reasons why that might be useful. One is to try and set some baseline standards around what it is we think should be expected from cloud providers, right? What it is that we want them to be doing in terms of data protection, so that when customers go in to sort of try and understand, are there big differences between these big providers, right? Is there some way to distinguish between what each of them is offering in terms of security? That's a little bit easier to understand. And so that they feel that there's some endorsement or some kind of assertion here that the company I'm relying on and that I'm trusting with a huge amount of potentially access, certainly responsibility to protect information that's presumably pretty important or pretty central to my operations, is somebody that's been vetted in some way. And I think the other part of that is that it perhaps creates a little bit more accountability. It means that if something does go wrong, if there is some large scale breach, if it turns out that my cloud provider is not actually doing all of the things that it said it would to protect my data, there's less of an emphasis on sort of the individual contracts that each customer is negotiating with those providers, and more of a sense of a sort of universal baseline. Doesn't mean there won't still be individual contracts. It doesn't mean that sort of different customers won't still need different types of security practices and sort of special arrangements, but perhaps it means that for some of the smaller, less knowledgeable customers, there will be a little bit more clarity and a little bit more sort of by way of standardized baseline security practices. So in that sense, I think it's a good idea. Now, I think what you hint at, and it's a really important piece, is that the implementation is hard, right? We don't actually have a universally agreed upon set of what we think everybody should be doing in terms of security. Even just not in the cloud, even just in terms of, if I'm storing a lot of data on my own servers, we don't necessarily have consensus on what everybody should be doing. We certainly don't have that around the cloud. The people who are probably in the most who are best poised to make those assessments are the people who are working for these companies, who understand really intimately what that should look like. And so that creates certain kinds of conflicts around who should make these decisions. And then there's a question of who's actually going to get access to go in and sort of look really deeply at these companies' security setups and make the judgment about whether or not they meet that standard. And so I think all of that is sort of important to think about. And then finally, the last thing I'd say is this is already an industry where you have a few very big, very dominant players. And once you add into that a certification process, which will presumably take time and cost money, you also have to start worrying about, is this going to hurt incumbents? Is this going to be something that just sort of solidifies the place of those giants at the top and makes it even harder for anybody to compete with them?
So I want to hear from the giant on the top, from Chelsea, before going to Trey. Chelsea, I know that that's not your direct responsibility, but can you think through with us, how would a company like Microsoft that has a huge offering in cloud react to the recommendation that the commission made?
Yeah. No, and actually, this is like right up my alley. So I think Josephine brought up superb points, right? It's funny, my husband is an engineer. And so whenever I ask him a question, the first two words out of his mouth is, it depends. And now I'm suddenly, finding myself giving this answer way more than I'd like, but it's true, right? So I think I have a couple points to add to Josephine's excellent things she already mentioned. I think that one of them is, when we think about, first of all, Solarium Commission report has, fantastic sort of recommendations, very holistic view of cybersecurity from a US focused lens. I would say, when we think about the process of certifications, one thing from an implementation or sort of the giant perspective, right, is thinking about, where can we sort of avoid redundancies? And so one of the things that I work very closely with is the US government program called FedRAMP. And this is actually a cloud certification program that if any of the cloud service providers, software providers, application providers, want to do business with the government and they have a cloud service capability, they have to go through this FedRAMP certification process. And what that ultimately provides, and I think Josephine was touching on this, how do we provide a level of assurance? Because we can't expect everybody to be cloud security experts. We can't even expect everybody to be security experts. And so these certification schemes, when done right and done very holistic, provide a level of assurance to all players involved. And I think, that's actually a really great program when we think about, how do we scale that? How do we learn from it? It's been around for a while. Another thing to add there too is, it's really important to consider sort of the program management aspects of certification schemes. So this is like, when rubber meets the road, how do we implement this? What are the requirements? Is there transparencies up front? There are a lot of really great baselines out there. You've got ISO standards. You got in the United States, the National Institute of Science and Technology has a lot of really good baselines for cloud security, and making sure there's like transparency around those and they're built into the schemes. And I actually think even just last week, ENISA, so the European Agency for Cybersecurity, actually just pushed out a date that they're looking to sort of push out draft schemes by the end of this year. And so, the more that that's sort of taken a holistic view across, well, what's already out there, what sectors already maybe have requirements in place, what are the existing standards for cloud service providers, and then how do we sort of integrate and mesh these to create a really clear, transparent way to provide assurance to users and customers. The better, but it's a very sort of complex issue that, there's probably bits and pieces in existence already. So figuring out where you can leverage those, where there needs to be net new sort of requirements or assurance levels, and just being very transparent about those upfront. So
those are very helpful. Before I go into Trey to finish out the trilogy here, I wanted to talk to our attendees. If you have questions, please begin to post them on the Q&A panel so that we can take your questions. And again, Trey, you have something to respond, perhaps?
No, I think these two really hit the majority of the points. Only thing I'd say about the Solarium Commission recommendation in particular is, as I recall, and I think as part of their concept, it was to be a baseline to satisfy a due diligence requirement for public support for cloud adoption, where that may be federal money going to states, it could be state money going to subsidiary state and local organizations, tribal organizations. So it was less about a strict regulatory baseline focused on security as the intended outcome and more about facilitating secure, low-level basic adoption. So I think the points that got raised here are good and illustrative of the diverse array of reasons that people approach these sorts of certification frameworks, despite their diversity, in some cases overlapping, in some cases presenting clear gaps, as well as just the challenge of certification as a whole. But I think I'll leave it there.
So I'm going to, warning Chelsea, I'm going to come to you next. We are thinking about it in the context of diplomacy, of international affairs. And some governments have begun to advocate for their own cloud. I want to have my own. European Union has their thoughts. Some of the governments around the world are beginning to think, is it feasible? Is it required? Do we have to do it for competitiveness reasons and so on and so forth? And of course, that's kind of disturbing, to say the least, of the major investments that have been made for global cloud deployment. So Chelsea, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that there are very, legitimate concerns for governments around the world pursuing sovereignty, right? Especially when we talk about technology. I think we can even talk about digital sovereignty. It's not even just sort of technology agnostic, right? It's also paving the way for your future. And so I would say, maybe the boiled down point here is it's a trade-off conversation, right? It's between, one, understanding what sort of the key priorities and concerns are, right? So if it is, I have a set of very critical data or information or workloads or services And I want to have all the bells and whistles to protect those. I want them to be, you know, close hold, making sure you almost like scope that out. And then you recognize that there is a cost, there is a service, there's a feature trade-off that you're probably making in the name of sort of confidentiality, security, availability. So that sort of the triage of your traditional bread and butter cybersecurity. But recognizing that also it's not really like a zero-sum conversation either, right? Because when we think about cloud, I mean, and Trey talked about this earlier, you have a stack of technologies, right? So we could be talking about the physical infrastructure, we could be talking about the services, we could be talking about the data. And so when you sort of do the homework from a customer, or I'm speaking here from a government perspective, right? You understand what is the most critical. You know, what am I willing to make those trade-offs on so I have, you know, maybe stronger security, or it's closer to home, but I'm willing to maybe give up some of the features that might come with that. And so maybe a couple of concrete examples here, right, is feature updates, right? So you might lose some of these when you start to move more into what is called a sovereign cloud. But again, you're retaining closer hold of data. You might have very particular interests there. You also have things about sort of telemetry and AI and, you know, being able to sort of integrate all these sort of really cool data analysis capabilities that you might not have access to when you sort of pursue maybe a more stringent policy. And again, it's hybrid. So, you know, I really, really encourage folks to think about that. What is the most sensitive, right? And then where am I willing to give those trade-offs economically, service, feature-wise, but realizing that there might be other data that I hold that, you know, I want to have access to those features, that analysis, the AI, and sort of the telemetry. So I'll say, you know, kind of pause there, but I think the conversation is very nuanced, and it's not really a black and white conversation. It's just understanding the risk, understanding the most key priorities, and sort of securing and making those trade-offs as appropriate.
Yeah, and I'm beginning to hear kind of echoes of what we spoke about in the prior question of shared responsibility. It seemed like a shared services model where you can have a big thing which is spread out to a lot of people, cloud, not just computers, not just data, but services themselves. And we're beginning to learn how those can be parsed, perhaps on a 60-40 model, where 60% is for everybody, 40% is nuance for the individual or for the nation or for the sovereign strategy. Trey, you did a lot of work back in your GW days on these kinds of international things. What's your take on this sovereign cloud dimension?
So this is a fun question for two reasons. One, there's a pervasive and recurring myth that having the ability to touch and hold and see your infrastructure allows you to secure it best. And we talked, and I know I mentioned control earlier, and I think there's a big distinction between control and security outcomes. The ability to pick what software you're running, to choose between different open source proprietary flavors, to pick the kind of companies that you're going to transact with, you know, again, to control the choices that are made about data and infrastructure that you use. These are control issues. Driving good security around those technologies is a distinct issue. And I think that one of the things that we run into when we talk about sovereign clouds is the sort of latent assumption that they're more secure if they're closer to home. And it's something I want to puncture that. And I think others have tried to puncture that balloon. So that's one issue. The second is, to what extent is there going to be differentiation? What does an EU cloud look like? What does an American cloud look like? What does a Chinese cloud look like? At certain levels, there are technical differences. Chinese require a different set of cryptographic standards that are commonly accepted in the US, the EU, and the majority of the rest of the world. It's a standards issue. There are some operational differences. The way that the US government, for example, handles its cloud operations for intelligence community, for the defense community, looks a little bit different than the public cloud that anyone in the US, EU, et cetera, can access. There are some strategic differences as well. What kinds of markets are these cloud companies able to act in? What kinds of data can they use and touch? These are all reasonable and meaningful distinctions. But the extent to which there needs to be a distinct national or supranational cloud to address any of those distinctions, I think is one that deserves a lot of scrutiny and careful consideration. So I look at a project like Gaia X, for example, and I hear a lot of language about really territorial approaches to technology, the notion that there needs to be a European fiefdom to compete with American companies. You know, this sort of recurring frustration with the results of Silicon Valley and the PC boom in the 80s and 90s and the explosion of the dot-com companies both before and after the bubble, that Europe hasn't had a really effective set of competitors or champions to line up with these same firms. And it's a fair historical issue, and it's an economic policy problem to the extent to which there needs to be distinct European companies and vendors for these technologies. But it doesn't really seem to animate the strategic discussion about an independent sovereign cloud relative to the benefits and especially relative to the significant costs. There was a Politico article about a month ago with language from mostly French government, but certain German government officials as well, talking about a $10 billion investment in the European cloud. This is a fourth or a fifth, realistically, of what it would take to build a comparable cloud deployment, even for the EU region, to what Microsoft, Amazon, and Google have spent on their infrastructure and spent over time developing and mastering these technologies. So all this is really just to say two things. One, there are significant differences in the way people view data, the equities around individual access, the liberties associated with how that data is processed and stored and translated and combined. And there are meaningful differences in national perspectives on how those choices should be made. All those are reasonable points of distinction that should be aired. The second is I don't think that trying to simply build an alternative infrastructure is the way to do that. There's very little chance, I think, to the extent we see this debate evolving, that what's going to happen is not a debate about technology sort of sovereignty and assertive economic policy, rather than these issues of data governance and individual liberty. So I think in some ways, while we don't even get to the issues that we want to in the way that we'd like in talking about a sovereign cloud, we also avoid some really critical choices and some difficult conversations about how this technology is used, it's built, and it's adopted. So I'm a little more negative on the concept. I just think it distracts us from some really important issues.
Thanks, Trey. And we're about ready to turn to our audience questions. They're already beginning to come in hot and furious. Joe, I wonder if you can finish out this cycle of discussions about the sovereign cloud idea.
Sure, I'll be quick so we can get to audience questions, because I think Trey covered a lot of what I would want to say, which is that I think these are often not conversations about security. And that is to say, they are often conversations framed as being about security. Security comes up constantly when countries talk about sort of what they view as the reasons and the motivations here. But I think a lot of the time they're very much conversations about sort of economic competition. They're very much conversations about data localization and the question of sort of where your data is being stored. And as Trey pointed out, those are often not the things that are really sort of technologically at the heart of how secure is your data. And so I do think that they're a sort of complicated set of conversations in which a lot of different things get tangled up with each other. And I think part of what's been hard about this is that since the United States has been one of the louder voices opposing some of the sort of ideas of data localization as effective means of data security, it has not been well taken, since so many of the big cloud companies are US based. Right. And I think that that's been a hard thing, that has not been an effective message, or the United States has not necessarily been an effective deliverer of that message, even though I think it's largely true. So let me stop there. I'm curious to hear from the audience.
Thanks, Josephine. Susan, I think we're ready to dive into the question part. And I see Monica Pellerano has teed up some interesting questions for us.
Well, let me read this one from Nate Kim, because it follows on what we were just talking about. He wants to know if the world somehow avoids the general trend of internet balkanization and cloud infrastructure continues to be shared, how will governance work? So, you got these national clouds. And by the way, just want to add that the United States has also put, there's legislation to have a national research cloud for AI. So what do we do here? Is an international treaty or some multinational governance organization the best way to go to govern the cloud?
The cloud, either in its global form or in its cannibalized, if you will, sovereign form. Purely a governance issue, like for the public administrator in us. Chelsea, you've unmuted first.
Yeah, no, first of all, this is a fantastic question, right? Because I think it's a question that maybe all of us in this space are really grappling with today. And, I think there's a couple of things that sort of come top of mind to me. I think one is, what are the tools that policymakers could use here to, I kind of think stepping back, right? Looking at the 100,000 foot level, right? We need to understand sort of what the goals are, right? So when we talk about a government that might be sort of pursuing an economic sovereignty, or I want to, set, my national security concerns are the primary, and then we can kind of work backwards. I feel like it's very difficult to have this conversation without understanding the ultimate intent. And so when we think about it from that perspective, if it is sort of fostering sort of international trade, if it's fostering having these companies work globally, I think there's going to be a different set of policy concerns that policymakers will take to make that happen. And I think from a cloud provider perspective, there are really kind of cool benefits to sort of unlock international markets, right? When we think about sort of countries or governments who might not have sort of access to this, and understanding that it's a lower cost alternative in a lot of ways to access this sort of global market. And that might be the priority. It might not be the priority, right? It might go back to that data sovereignty, sort of national security, charting my own course conversation, which is a different set of sort of requirements. I think maybe the easiest thing, though, when I think about this question is, having sort of that international agreements, whether that's a multinational, whether that's bilateral. I mean, we see these through trade agreements, even sort of more recently coming up. I think standards are always a really good way. I mean, if we can all talk the same talk and have the same taxonomy when we refer to this, and all sort of understand fundamentally the same requirements that we're talking about, that's another really good sort of vector or mechanism or tool that we could use to sort of foster this. Because I think the risk at the end of the day is, if we don't sort of agree on standardizations, we're probably not going to be speaking the same language. You're going to lose interoperability. You might even lose some of that competitiveness that I think we're touching on a little bit too, right? I had a interesting story. I'll just add really quick on this. My husband and I, a couple months ago, were watching a History Channel. Please don't judge, Friday night COVID times, right? You do what you need to for entertainment. But and it was a really interesting story in about, I'm going to say like maybe 1918, you had France and Spain building a railroad. And it was going to be cutting across the Pyrenees. It was going to be the longest sort of international trade route that would have existed at the time via railroad. And it was going to connect sort of the Iberian Peninsula to continental Europe, right? And so you had this giant press event where they were going to do the grand opening of the railroad tracks in a little town on the border of, I want to say, in Spain, in the Pyrenees. And when they went to do the final nail in the track, they realized the track sizes were different. And so you've had this like this huge investment, right? I mean, probably hundreds of millions of dollars at the time. And then suddenly nothing goes because they didn't sort of have the same standards for railroad widths. And so I think this is a very good sort of example of why that is such a critical thing. It's not just a nice to have, it really will help this conversation, help global trade, help sort of, untap markets and things like that. So good question from Nate, though. It's a great one.
Before turning to our other panelists, I'm also reminded that cybersecurity issues are also always multidisciplinary. And what we need is not just good software engineers, not good hardware engineers, but also political scientists, also public administration experts, also legal eagles that can craft not only legislation, but law that can help us muddle through this imperative to have shared responsibility. You talked about it before, shared responsibility. Here we are again, we call it something different. We call it governance. Joe, would you like to weigh in, or Trey?
Sure. I'll just add quickly, I think, my model for what cloud governance will look like moving forward is very much what internet governance has looked like in the past, where we've seen a lot of different countries figure out how to make policies and pass laws that touch on a global network. And the big multinational companies have sort of had to figure out, how do you abide by all of those laws and figure out sort of the right way to implement everything without, fracturing the sort of fundamental architecture, but also creating slightly different online ecosystems in all of these different places that respect all of their different laws. I would expect to see something similar around the cloud, where everybody's going to kind of come out with their own, whether it's a certification or a law or whatever else, and the big providers will figure out how to work with that. The other thing I'd say is, I think probably ultimately what this means is that all governments, or most governments, will have access to more data through lawful requests. That is sort of the evolution of what we've seen in the US with the Cloud Act, where countries say, look, if we're going to let you store data anywhere in the world, then we need to be able to access that using the mechanisms that we used to be able to use to access things stored within our own country. And that probably what that ultimately leads to is potentially less ability to sort of conduct some kinds of technological surveillance, though maybe not, but certainly a much greater ability to use those lawful interception capabilities for data stored around the world.
That's good. That's a great point. Trey?
I'll just say, I think when we talk about governance, it really depends on the depth of the technical specificity. There's I think the model that Josephine puts forward about internet governance for this makes a lot of sense, that there are diverse technical standards that companies come together to address in ways that meet their own proprietary needs, but they're interoperable and common enough to be able to speak to each other. At a high level, I think what we're looking for is a situation where industry is allowed to set technical standards, and a government-led governance apparatus gives industry the opportunity to do that, but tells them which choices, which standards they can operate on. Effectively, where government has the role to set the decision-making parameters, and companies have the role to fill that with specifics that fit their needs. And so I think the question of fragmentation is a good one. The cloud and the internet are bound together in their history in a very interesting and compelling way. But we are also likely to see a variety of approaches where the size and the power of these cloud vendors' network boundaries is such that they may very well be able to translate on the fly between multiple geographic internets, the Caucasus internet and the Western European internet and the American internet over time. It's not an ideal outcome by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think we'll be able to manage that, just at least for a generation.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Susan, do you have a favorite? I'd suggest that Monica
No.
Pelourinho-
We have some more time.
We have some more time. Okay, great. We'll keep going.
Let me add something that should give us hope. Recent news today: the French government has gone to the Biden transition and offered some compromises on digital taxes. And I think the United States has an opportunity to work with Europe, now with the Biden administration on related issues through the cloud. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some good movement. I wonder what you all think. Does anyone want to comment?
I only say I make it a point to steer clear of both, French policy with respect to taxes when it comes to the technology. But there has been a strong animus towards the digital tax. There's a reason that it's been pushed so far and so hard. And I don't think the Biden transition is going to be an opportunity to take that animus completely away. It may ameliorate it or shape it in a more feasible fashion. Certainly the French have represented a very strong negotiating position, but the underlying contention about how countries are able to harvest value from data, again, sort of pushing us away from how citizens are able to harvest value from their data, but that's probably a separate topic for another time. That question of countries harvesting that value is not going to go away, not quickly and not quietly.
Especially in COVID-19 times. Okay, Monica asks, she wants to know about, you guys have talked about malicious attacks, but she wants to know about how you come up with robustness measures when you have non-malicious events such as natural disasters. And what does that mean for the adjudication of responsibilities between cloud providers and customers?
Yeah, so I'm happy to sort of take a stab at this one. I think there's probably a couple angles here, right? I actually think one of the really big benefits of cloud security is to offer a redundancy. And we talk about redundancy. This is both like physical. This is also in terms of your bread and butter cybersecurity redundancy, backups, et cetera. And so you have access to sort of these different physical places where maybe data centers are held and they're redundantly backed up, in different places. So it provides a lot of availability, but it also provides a lot of redundancy and robustness from that perspective. I will also say that's just a very sort of like physical robustness sort of angle to take, but there's other ones too, right? So you also have access to sort of security capabilities, which will also provide that redundancy. You sort of have it as a core interest, I would say. I don't think this is sort of controversial that, you want to be able to provide that availability. I mean, that is cloud service providers. Like what are the redundancies? There's a networking conversation there. How do I always provide my services are always on? How are they always available? How are they always being backed up? So I think it's like a really great question. And there's probably different ways you can sort of tackle that. So.
Chelsea, that's a great point. And if I can go into the disaster risk reduction side of the fence, there's a conversation between nations to move away from hazard identification and resolution and more towards disaster risk reduction. And the question has been, how do you begin to identify the risk? How do you begin to reduce the risk while the actual explosion, the actual disaster hasn't yet happened? And I think that conversation is going well in the earthquake community, is going well in the fire and floods and other disasters community. The cybersecurity angle isn't really being discussed yet. And I know because I've been part of a conversation in Geneva with the disaster risk reduction folks, and I've been trying to push the notion of, hey, if we were to lose half the internet for some reason or half the cloud for some reason, it would be a disaster. Milk trucks wouldn't run and doctors wouldn't be able to take my pulse and so on and so forth. And yet we're not ready necessarily to run a disaster risk reduction exercise, whether it's at the corporate level, at a national level, at a regional level, at a sectoral level. Well, the mind kind of blows up in terms of where to begin.
Yeah, so I would say just really quickly two things. Risk management principles 101 really apply here when we think about disaster recovery. I mean, it's something we use every day. It's something that you can really make those decisions on priorities and understanding, like in the moment of a disaster, what are your critical services? What always needs to be on, right? I always need to be able to connect to a 911 call. I think is a really good example from like a telecommunications perspective. And so sort of understanding what those critical things that need to be always on are and always available. I would also say too that from a disaster sort of recovery and reaction perspective, this is an interesting conversation that I've seen sort of evolve more recently, but there's the cyber insurance conversation here too, right? Because you could be talking like really big disasters, and understanding where is sort of the role for cyber insurance to sort of backstop some of these issues. And it's an interesting conversation I've seen evolved a little bit more recently. But there's a point where you almost have to ask that question because it might just be such a severe incident. Where is sort of the guarantees on the back end from that? So.
Trey?
It's an interesting question. And again, Chelsea hits it on the head with shared responsibility. And you hear that language across all the hyperscalers. If you give your data over, your services over to a major cloud company, it's on them to adhere to what are some relatively robust ISO standards with respect to physical security and disaster preparedness. There's contractual language with service level availability and other obligations that determine there'll be a financial penalty if providers aren't able to provide those services for a significant percentage of, we talk about 5, 9, 6 nines percentage of the contract period. And there are some pretty remarkable physical security measures in place with these facilities. I will share an anecdote from visiting one of the hyperscaler facilities 3 or 4 years ago in Virginia, and you go through successive levels of national security, like physical barriers and identity checks, and then man traps and armed guards, and the kind of partitioned access to these facilities that it does remind you of an intelligence facility, and with this sort of incredibly massive, really just physically significant energy backup systems, where there's 2 or 3 layers of redundancy and making sure that there's power. And there are still disasters. Lightning strikes take down equipment, and botched updates take down networks for hours or days at a time. But I think it's something that there is a more significant appreciation of in the community, and slightly more concrete standards and practices for. The flip side to that, or just the one little caveat, is to come back to the sovereignty discussion. Part of the robust and resilient, although resilient in a slightly different sense, model for these kinds of facilities is where they can be placed and provisioned in ways that are dictated as best practice by those standards and by community members in that space, where it becomes incumbent on the providers to put facilities in less optimal locations to compromise their architecture so that these facilities or these operations can fit in a specific or even outdated jurisdictional set of requirements. That can reduce that sort of resilience against physical harm and against natural disasters, where I have to put a data center in the path of a hurricane because it's not a very big country and the whole country's in the path of hurricanes, right? That's a significant limitation on that sort of redundancy. So I do think it's kind of an interesting color as we think about the sovereign cloud discussion. To what extent is that inability to place facilities in a globally optimized arrangement undermine the sort of benefits that come with respect physical risk and natural disasters?
Yeah. Joe, did you have something to say?
I would say, very similar to what Chelsea and Trey have brought up. I think there's tremendous resilience benefits that we see from the cloud, no question, but most of those benefits come from being able to keep copies of data in different locations. And so once you start restricting where can my data be stored and which countries can it be stored in and all of that, then you start to see some erosion of those benefits. And the other thing I'd say, going back to a point Chelsea made, is I think for any individual customer, there's no question you get a lot more resilience from having your data sort of stored by one of these giants that can keep sort of copies of it all over the world. On the other hand, I think that if there is at some point, as presumably there will be some kind of outage, the impacts of that will be much larger than, anything as sort of one individual company or one individual server farm getting hit. And so sort of coming back to that insurance piece that Chelsea raised, coming back to thinking about sort of as we have more of these entities that thousands and thousands and thousands of different businesses are relying on, then how prepared are we to kind of deal with the fact that even as resilient as they are, probably at some point something will happen that will cause a fairly large scale outage for some period of time. And sort of, do we know how to respond to that? Do they know how to respond to that? Do we know who's going to pay for it? All of those, I think, are questions that we still need to be thinking about, even though I think on the whole, they've brought about a fairly significantly improved resilience environment.
Yeah, and just to cap up the conversation, the word resilient and sustainable does have a second meaning as well, and that is that many people have accused the big data farms that exist to create the cloud by being energy suckers. They just kind of gobble up all the energy, and you look around and what about the people who live there in the footprint of the actual facility? There are some questions to be raised on that. I'm going to suggest that I don't know, Susan, you're the big timekeeper, but I'll suggest that perhaps we begin to think about some wrap-up remarks from each of the three excellent panelists that can bring us to a close. We've been through an interesting landscape. Some common themes have emerged about shared responsibility, about governance, about risk reduction, and about competitiveness, global competitiveness, and what's driving this push to cloud security. So who would like to go first to kind of wrap us up? 11:30, I think we've got another 10 minutes or so, Susan, am I right? So who'd like to go first to offer some wrap-up remarks for about 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes each? Joe, you were the one with your microphone on, so you
That
get
is
the
true.
short straw.
Okay. So I think wrap-up remarks. What I would say is, I think, I'm a cybersecurity policy researcher. So I come back to the question of what does the cloud mean for cybersecurity policy, and what makes it sort of different from the kinds of cybersecurity policy that has come before or is already in progress around other areas related to the internet and to data protection. And I think there are a couple things that the cloud has really shifted the conversation on, for better and for worse. A big part of that is the data localization debate. And I don't see that going away, right? I think that sort of spearheaded by China, but with other countries definitely taking note and being interested, there's going to be more discussion in more different places around the question of sort of how much security or whether you gain any security at all from having data within your own borders on your own sort of physical territory. And that's a conversation that I think will end up sort of leading to some of the divergence around policy frameworks that we see in different countries. Not the only divergence, but a big one that we've seen so far. The countries that feel they want all of their data stored in their own borders, and the countries that are willing to forego that, but replace it perhaps with certain kinds of Cloud Act equivalents in which they are talking about lawful access to data that's stored outside of their borders, or trying to perhaps more generally expand what their national jurisdiction applies to. And I think that's been a theme of internet sort of regulation up to this point, is individual countries trying to understand how far can my own national laws reach on a global network? Can I use them to access data that's stored outside my own country? Can I use them to influence the ways that data is being transferred beyond my borders? I think you're going to see that sort of that really accelerate around issues of the cloud. And I think probably sort of in a lot of ways, the cloud computing debates are going to force some of the harder conversations that we've perhaps avoided so far in thinking about internet regulation. And by that, I mean, they're going to force us to confront the question of which are the countries that absolutely do not trust each other and will not trust each other under any circumstances, and what it means to try and maintain an ostensibly global internet under those circumstances. And they're going to force us to have some of the conversations about what governments absolutely require access to, and how they're going to sort of find ways to access that even as the data storage landscape changes. And I think for the most part, those are all conversations that it's worth having out in the open and sort of seeing those fights play out. But I do think they'll be hard. I think there's a reason that we've been avoiding them for 20 or so years.
Thanks, Joe. Chelsea?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add to Josephine's points and to close out here, I mean, there are a lot of really exciting, challenging things, I think, to work through in the next couple of years when we talk about cloud security. I'm excited certainly to be, plugged into it. I would say when I think about what some of these big question categories are, right? It's the data sovereignty question, understanding the priorities, understanding the ultimate end goals, and understanding where there is not really a black and white approach to sort of address those concerns. And I certainly look forward to seeing how that evolves over time. I think foundationally, right, there is really a need for just better education and awareness of this technology. And that's not sort of meant to be sort of a cop-out answer here, but I think the more that both technologists, consumers, and also policymakers, really understand some of this technology and what it is and how it's used, pros and cons of it, I think will be better for us all. I think we all had to suddenly become a little bit more cybersecurity savvy through COVID, right? I've certainly seen that on work with the Cyber Readiness Institute that helps small, medium-sized businesses with this, right? It's like, oh, suddenly I'm not just going into the office anymore. So what's the role that policymakers, customers, consumers, and cloud service providers can play in education and awareness? I think another third point that I'd like to close out when we talk about cloud security here is the real need for a diverse and skilled workforce. It is like one of these conversations that's never really glamorous, but there is like I think there's anywhere from 1 to 3 million in the US alone shortage. There's an inclusivity problem there. In the United States, I'm speaking just here in particular, right? I think some less than 50% of high schools in the United States even have a computer science program, not even talking about cybersecurity. So I would really like the conversation to evolve here in the next couple of years too, because I think you get smarter people, you can really solve a lot of these really, really complex problems. And we really just need to sort of build that up foundationally in our workforce, in our education. And then I think one other maybe final point that I will say is really understand the trade-offs between innovation and risk management, right? You can achieve both, but they really need to work together. And when we talk about cybersecurity, at the end of the day, it's risk management. What are the priorities? How am I securing them? How am I securing customer data? How am I respecting their privacy? And that's not going to look the same based on geography. And I kind of look forward to seeing how these frameworks and models evolve in different areas where they meet their different sort of priorities and goals. So that's kind of my closeout.
Thanks, Chelsea. So agree with you about the need for education and more diverse workforce, especially women in cybersecurity workforce. You're still scraping at the bottom of the barrel, 22%, 23%. I'm a member of the board of the Women in Cybersecurity organization, which is global, and several others are trying to do their bit to promote the notion of gender diversity and other diversity in the workforce. So that's a huge area. Trey.
No, it's great. I want to foot stomp Chelsea and Costis the point about diversity. It's incumbent on us to have a policy workforce that reflects the user base, and that's something that there's a delta there, and I think it is getting better in certain instances and not in others. The language about risk management is really what drives me in thinking about the last point. When we talk about assessing risk and managing risk, the part of the discussion that tends to get left out is assessing the threshold of your tolerable risk. And who sets that threshold is a really important part of this conversation. If it's a user, if it's a vendor, if it's a cloud provider, or if it's a government. And that conversation looks different in these different jurisdictions. But part of that is because who sits in that catbird seat to set that threshold is different in many of these cases. So for me, I think there's kind of four small trends that I see influencing the discussion that are interesting. One, from the technology side, cloud providers, really cloud computing. I mean, these are magnificent engines of complexity that we've built here. And we're seeing some really intriguing trends on how hardware is built, how semiconductors are designed in particular, that is fragmenting the power of that ecosystem away from a small number of very powerful vendors to a lot of startups and a lot of mid-tier companies that used to be more specialized. So the very chips that we're relying on are going to start to diversify in a way that could hold some really interesting potential, both in terms of managing risk, but also opportunity for these vendors to differentiate themselves. Second, from an operational standpoint, we see cloud companies operating with fragmentation. And what I think is actually interesting, but also a little dangerous, is in some ways it's competitively advisable to accept that fragmentation and embrace it. 5 years ago, the cloud providers, especially the large US firms, would have been some of the staunchest opponents of data localization requirements. But it's not feasible to continue to say no to a government when you have Amazon or your other competitors nipping at your heels. And so technical compromises and engineering workarounds have become the order of the day. And now you're starting to see some companies. Google just announced a new project offering, I think 6 or 7 weeks ago, about localized and secure virtual machine instances. It's an offering. It's no longer a regulatory challenge. It's actually part of the product space. And it's companies trying to take advantage of these sorts of realities to continue to claw their way forward in this incredibly competitive market that's changing what we see, I think, in some ways as accepted norms. And what's technically advisable. So the operations with fragmentation, I think that's going to continue to define the discussion, embracing it. Third, from the market standpoint, is at least the US firms are starting to differentiate themselves. And where you have Amazon as absolutely the leader in terms of overall scale, and Microsoft modeling very similar to Amazon, but with a strong SaaS and software as a service set of products, Google is starting to move into a different direction where kind of presenting themselves as the middleware for cloud. Everybody should be using Google, even if they're not using Google for all of their cloud services, which is a really interesting pitch. And they're spending a tremendous amount of money and investing in new talent, technology to make that feasible. And it will remain to be seen how that influences the regulatory debate if Google suddenly becomes part of every cloud computing stack, especially for data intensive, machine learning intensive applications. And lastly, just on the policy side, cloud is changing. When Amazon Web Services was launched in 2006, and through the emergence of Azure in particular and Google Cloud project behind that, a lot of what we talked about with cloud was infrastructure as a service, renting computing resources, bandwidth, storage, and serving the data that customers use and that providers have across those. More recently, since maybe 2015, 2016 or so, platform as a service offerings have started to dominate. And those are far more data intensive, not just in terms of the data that they require, but they are themselves shaped to a great extent by users' data, by how users use them. And so as we're coming into this conversation about governance of data, it's going to be important. And I agree absolutely with my co-presenters here. Policymakers have got to sprint to catch up because the questions that we're talking about are about to add another dimension in terms of data informing the use and construction of those services, not just data being used by those services. And if we don't have governance models and a regulatory approach that matches up to that, it could very well hobble industry, create unnecessary gaps in risk management models, unnecessary risk, but also just lead to, especially in the transatlantic relationship, friction that's unnecessary and that's counterproductive and doesn't really address a lot of the core questions around individual equities and liberties that are motivating and should be the center of a lot of our discussion. So I'm hopeful, a lot of progress to be made, lots more conversations like this hopefully to happen. And yeah, thank you guys, Costis and Susan, and for the hub, especially for hosting us. This has been fantastic, but thank you in particular to Chelsea and Josephine for taking time out of their day. It's been fun talking with you guys.
Great. Over to you, Susan, to close us out.
Well, thank you all so much for participating. In particular, thanks to our audience for joining us. And please accept my apologies for we didn't have enough time to answer everybody's questions. Our next webinar will be on a new notion, collective data rights and their role in personal data protection. So I hope you can join us for that. It'll probably be the second week in December. And I hope everybody has a great Thanksgiving, or if you live in other countries outside of the United States, a great week. Thank you, and my best to you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.